Hello, my name is Adam Winrich, and this video is about different methods for dropping strands while making a whip. Say, are you a paracord whip maker? Whoever was making a very fancy chevron patterned paracord whip only to have your pattern ruined when you dropped your strands? Well, stay tuned to this video and maybe I can help you out. So first, before I go further, I'd like to give a big shout out to my two new patrons on Patreon. They are Kevin Raber and Preston M. Thank you so much. If you guys want to be as cool as them for as little as $1 a month, you can also subscribe to my Patreon. Every person who subscribes to me on Patreon gets a 10% discount on any whips they order from me. All right, so let's talk some more about strand dropping. First, why am I making this video? Well, I just got done making a whole pile of whips from both Spectra. I made 5 of them, and then I made several out of 275 cord, and I actually used every strand dropping method I know in this pile of whips. I thought it'd be interesting to try to document what different methods I was using. And so it's also a little bit of a mental challenge to try to sort through this quagmire of strand dropping. So I do have 6 goals in this video that I'm going to try to get through. They are: describe 4 strand dropping methods, show examples of each one. I made all these little examples this morning out of scraps of paracord that I got, so I'll show you a little bit more of that in detail so you can see the differences. I'm going to explain what I mean when I say dropping out the front, out the back, and a double up. I originally got these terms from Strand, and apparently they're very confusing to everybody else. So hopefully once I said them a few times, out the front, out the back, and what a double up is, that everyone will know what I mean. And see, I'm gonna explain the different methods that I use and why I use them. And I'm also going to discuss different methods used by classic whip makers such as David Morgan, Joe Strand, Terry Jack, and Leonard Wheatley. And finally, I'm going to cover the 4 most important things when it comes to dropping strands. All right, so that's the goals of my video. So now I'm going to move on and show you some close-ups of these little samples that I made. So here are 4 samples of different methods of strand dropping that I use. So this one is called out the front with no double up. This one I call out the front with a double up. This one I call out the back with a double up. There's the front seam, but then you see there's the strand drop in the back. And then this one is 2 strands at the same time, both out the front with no double up. So in all these samples I've started with 8 plat, and then in these first 3 I've only dropped 1 strand to go to 7, and this last one I dropped strands to get from 8 down to 6. So I'll try to give you a little closer look on it so you can see. With this first one where I say it's out the front with no double up, what you end up with is just a little bitty gap right there, and so that's probably the least obtrusive of the strand drops. Then with this one here, out the front with a double up, you can clearly see it's the side seam that ends up with a double up. Then we've got this one I call out the back, where you can see the front looks totally normal, sides basically look normal, and then it's now out in the back that you see this little double up in the back seam. So for some reason, I guess I think customers buying whips see double ups easier when they're on the side of the whip, on the side seam, than when they're on the back. So I tend to use this one more when I'm making paracord whips, and I also use this other one out the front. And then finally, maybe the least obtrusive or least noticeable is 2 strands both out the front. And with this sample right here, what I do is you braid 8 strands. I cut 2 strands out of the core. I drop 2 strands out the front at the same time. And then when I've braided a little bit further, I'll actually flip the thing over and then continue braiding. So when I go to drop again, I just have to drop 2 more strands out the front. So in case it's not clear what I mean by these terms, I'm going to get out a little drawing and try to explain things in more detail. So I got this little drawing right here that I made of essentially an 8-strand braiding pattern, standard herringbone pattern. Again, shout out to Kevin Raber and Preston M, who are now patrons of me on Patreon. All right, so let's say we get to this scenario here, and now we're going to drop strands. So in the 2 methods where I'm going to say out the front, the strand that's going to be dropped is this one right here. So I'm going to sort of generally say that any strands that are up here are, say, in the back. Any strands that are down here, closer to you, the whip maker, are in the front. So this is the strand that we're going to drop. Now if I want to drop this strand out the front with no double up, what I'm going to do is this strand will be moved to the core, and then instead of bringing this one around and going under 2 over 2, I'm going to go under 2 over 1. So this one will be in the core. I'm going essentially over this one, but I'm also going to go up over this one. So now I'm into a sort of under 2 over 1 pattern, and that gives me no double up. So that is out the front, no double up. Now if I do out the front with a double up, again this strand is being dropped, but instead of coming around and going under this one and this one over this one, I'm going to go under 1 over 2. So you can see if I go over 2 right here, the seam will match up with this strand right here, the previous stitch. So I'm going to end up with over 2 and a double up. So that's out the front with a double up. So now moving on, we're going to talk about out the back. So out the back means that instead of dropping this strand right here, I'm going to drop this strand right here, the next one that I'm going to bring around in the braiding pattern. So what I would do is bring this strand around and bring it around. I go over the core, but under all of these strands. And then right away, I'm going to bring this next strand around and go under 2 over 2. So that's what gives me a double up on the back seam. So there, I basically did my best to explain how to go out the front with no double up, out the front with a double up, and then out the back. So now I'll let you know when I use these different methods. So here I am again with my 4 strand dropping samples. Again, they are out the front, no double up, out the front with a double up, out the back where you get the double up on the back seam, and then 2 strands out the front, no double up at the same time, and then you flip the thing over. So usually the one I never use is this one. I guess I don't like having my double up on the side seam. So generally when I'm dropping strands, I would drop one out the front first, and then in paracord usually I'd braid a little bit further, and then I would drop another one out the front, and then my next 2 strands I would drop out the back in this pattern. And so that's generally with paracord. Usually with paracord, because it's bulky, I always try to have a strand in the core that I can cut out when I drop a strand, so I don't end up with the braiding getting bigger. And then if I'm doing, say, finer work like a 275 cord or kangaroo work, I'm going to use this last method here, where I'll drop 2 strands at the same time, cutting 2 strands out of the core when I do my drop, and then flipping the braiding over once I'm done. So those are the methods that I use. Now let's look at some whips and talk about the methods that other whip makers use. So now I'd like to talk about the methods used by the classic whip makers, some of the more important whip makers in whip making history. Quickly, before I do that, I am aware that I've seen other whip videos where they can only be understood by people that already understand everything that is in the video. And I think trying to cover strand dropping is a really tough subject, so this is probably one of those videos. So my apologies if everything is as clear as mud. I'm going to keep going. So some whip makers I'm going to talk about, just 4 of them. First, David Morgan. When he would drop his strands, he was dropping both strands out the front, and one side would have no double up and one side would have a double up. So if he was going from 12 to 10, his right side would have no double up, but his left side would have a double up. But of course David was mostly working in one color, either natural kangaroo or black kangaroo, so the double ups don't show up as much when you're using one color. They really show up when you're using 2 colors. And then next, talk about Joe Strand and Terry Jacka. Both of them would drop 1 strand out at the front with no double up, and then they drop the other strand out the back. And that's how they did it on all their whips, whether they were 1 color or 2-tone. And then finally, Leonard Wheatley, he was using thick cowhide for his whips. Probably not enough people know about Leonard Wheatley. He made a lot of whips for performers back in the 1980s and 90s, and he made them all out of chrome tan cowhide, and they had all wood handles. So he would always drop 1 strand at a time, and he was always dropping his strands out the front. So sometimes without a double up, sometimes with a double up. And last thing I want to talk about in this video, the 4 most important things you make sure you have happen when you drop strands. Number 1, most important, is make sure the strand does not pull out while the whip is being used. I've had that happen on some expensive kangaroo whips that I bought, and I didn't like it, and there's nothing you can do to fix it once it happens. It's a real bummer. So like in these Spectre bull whips that I made, because the Spectre is kind of slippery, I tried to make sure I left enough of this drop strand in the core so it wouldn't pull out. Usually I'd leave at least 3 to 6 inches in the core, maybe more, to make sure it won't pull back out. That's pretty much the key to making sure the strand won't pull out, so make sure that there's enough left inside the core. And then also you want to make sure there are no lumps. So usually with lumps, the way I avoid that is like in making a paracord whip. When you drop a strand, you want to make sure you have something to cut out of the core or the inside of the whip when that strand goes in, because you are adding material to the inside of the whip. So I'll usually say a strand drops right here. I'd already have a strand in the core from my previous drop, and right when I get to my next strand drop, then I'll cut out that last drop strand and I'm ready to drop the next one. And you also want to make sure there are no kinks. Kinks can kind of happen, say, especially if you're dropping 2 strands at once and your plaiting angle really changes. Say if you're plaiting along like this at a nice sort of 90-degree angle, and you drop some strands and it goes up like this, but once you change the angle, that'll actually change sort of the tension of your plaiting. So you can go from sort of a looser plaiting to tighter plaiting, and that can put a kink in the whip. So you want to be careful to avoid that and try to keep your plaiting angle kind of the same as possible. And finally, when you're dropping, I showed a little bit with the gaps in your strand drops. Like if you're dropping a strand out the front with no double up, try to avoid gaps in your strand drops. Gaps are a big way that people will notice that, oh, you dropped a strand there. Because that's one of the skills of making a whip, now especially a leather whip, is hiding your strand drops as well as possible. As a little addition to the video, I'm going to show you up. Here's the 2 sets of stock whips and a bull whip by some excellent whip makers. These are by Russell Schultz of Australia. If you don't know about Russell Schultz, you should learn more about him. These are by Tony Nugent, also from Australia. And this is by Blake Gorey of Smoky Mountain Whips. All of them top whip makers. So all of these guys use the method of they dropped 2 strands out the front with no double up, and then they continue to braid a little bit, and then they flip the whole work over, so then their back seam basically now became their front seam, and then they continued to braid, so then the next drop would be again out the front with no double up. So this is what the top whip makers in the world are doing. Well, there's a video about dropping strands. My name is Adam Winrich. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you'd like to be super cool and subscribe to me on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, I'll put a link to my Patreon in the description, and any of my Patreon subscribers get a 10% discount on any whips I make. Well, have a great day.